Hey, it's me, Leonard Miltch again, and I received a pay raise. You guys have really screwed me. It was the uptick in business the last few days that made me stand in line. I visited a store, one called Bo's Discount Liquors. I needed something to cope with the news. We had 500 new sign-ups since the last time I shared my story. The boss tried to figure out why we had the surge, but luckily, he did not have a clue. He found one thing odd, though. It was that so many people had requested me by name. The good news was he gave me $1 pay raise. Not enough to pay for therapy, however it could afford more whiskey. That's why I stood at the register in a seedy part of town. The 20-something clerk stared at me with judgment. He was an awkward-looking fellow with freckled skin and red hair. He shot a smirk toward me. "Anything else I can get you today?" he asked. "Just 2 packs of Camels, please." He reached down and grabbed the cigarettes. "Planning on having a wild night?" "No, I'm just getting ready to head into work." He chuckled as he placed 2 bottles of whiskey, cigarettes, and gum in a brown bag. The clerk looked at me to see if I was laughing. He thought I was joking, but I was not. "Oh, that will be $58, he said as he slid the bag across the counter. That's when I heard my phone ring. I lifted the phone up to see it was my boss. I quickly paid the clerk and exited the building. "Hello? How are you doing, killer?" "I'm doing fine," I answered while I opened my car door and sat inside. I fumbled around with the bag, reaching for the pack of cigarettes. I lit one, taking a long drag. The sound of his voice made me feel like a ball of nerves for some reason. "So we're gonna have to change your schedule, Leonard. We've had a little bit of an issue come up." I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of whiskey and retrieving my flask. I trembled while filling it. Someone had informed the boss of me sharing my story, and he finally must have figured it out. "And what's that, boss?" I asked nervously. "Well, I spoke to a potential client today. She was a real peach. Yeah, a real rotten one, really," he answered, and I hung on to every word. "What does that have to do with me?" "Well, I need my killer to do some damage control for me. This lady seems furious. Her name is Gladys Hean, and she hasn't even been signed up for a week. She wants to know what's taking us so long to get to her." I instantly felt relieved. Didn't she read it usually takes 4 to 5 business days for a rep to contact her? I took a sip from my flask as the clerk watched from inside the store. He continued to judge me, but at the moment, I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was my boss had not found out. I leaned back in my seat and relaxed, trying to seem composed. "Lou tried to explain that to her. She wasn't having any of it. Apparently, she ripped him a new asshole over it, then asked to speak to me directly." "What can I do then, boss?" I asked, with a smile on my face knowing Lou got chewed out over the phone. "I need someone to visit her, and she's about an hour away from you. You know how we strive to be prompt in our services, so I need you to go kill it for me." "All right, I can do that for you, boss." "Perfect. I will shoot you the address. Reach out to me after you've spoken to her," he said before the phone clicked. I sat in the car finishing my cigarette as I waited for the message. My phone chimed and I saw the name with her address. I could already see her in my head, a grumpy old woman who loved soap operas and she watched them with a small dog that loved to bark. I plugged the location into my phone and started my car. I felt a sinking feeling. I knew I would regret this. But I put my car into gear and headed toward the residence for my future client. I turned up the street. It was a row of nicer homes that lined it. The feeling of the neighborhood was of an upper middle class. 2 teenage boys played basketball on the street. They both looked to be around 16 to 17. I slowed down my car, searching for her house and not wanting to run down the teens. I parked next to the wooden picket fence. Behind it sat a house that was cream-colored. A large weeping willow sat in the middle of the yard. The grass seemed reasonably well kept, but I noticed lots of holes dug around the yard. "All right, Leo, let's do this," I said out loud while trying to psych myself up. as I lit one last cigarette. I needed to try to sell her on the knives. I reached for my flask and took a long drink, trying to ready my nerves before I exited the car. My briefcase sat in the passenger seat like it usually did, but looking at it gave me chills. The black box rested inside. My hand shook as I reached for it. The sight of her blue eyes came to my mind. The thud startled me when the basketball bounced off the hood of my car. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I turned to see one of the teenage boys running toward my direction. He wore a black t-shirt and red gym shorts. His brown hair covered in sweat as it dripped onto his olive skin when he stopped outside the car, with a frown on his face. Another boy followed him. His hair was a sandy blonde, and he wore a gray shirt with a pair of jeans. He at least smiled. "Dude, you look like you're about to hand out religious pamphlets," he sneered as I walked out of the car holding my briefcase. "Yeah, I'm not much of the religious type," I said while surveying the hood. I wanted to make sure the ball didn't leave a dent. It was a company car. "So would you know where Gladys Hean lives?" "I'd say you're on the right track. You're parked in front of the old bitch's house." I walked around the car and retrieved the ball, tossing it back to the boy. At least I knew for sure I was in the right place, but judging from the angsty teen, she already sounded like a pain in the ass. "Thanks," I replied. Maybe watch out next time, too." "Whatever, man. Good luck giving your pamphlets to that old hag." "Come on, James, she isn't that bad," the other boy chimed in, as he playfully pushed him. I stared at the house for a moment, opening the gate. The sound of a small dog barking came up from inside the house. It was predictable. I stepped onto the porch, knocking on the door. I unwrapped a piece of gum, placing it in my mouth, but worried it wouldn't be enough. I had really overdone it with the whiskey today. "Missy, shut your mouth!" a voice screeched. The door opened with a shorter lady stepping out. She had gray hair and splotches on her face. It didn't help her much that she also scowled. "Hello there. My name is Leonard Miltch, but you can call me Leo," I said as I extended my hand out to shake hers. "I work for EKINC, and my boss wanted to apologize for the holdup." She stared at my hand before walking past me to gaze at the kids. "James Shelby, you better not come near my house again!" Gladys turned around and looked back at me. Her eyes carried anger, one that made her pupils bore a hole through me. It was like she was sizing me up. And while I would never admit it, I felt a bit intimidated by this crabby old woman. "It took you long enough. I was starting to think all of you were incompetent," she growled. "I assure you, ma'am, we are not. We strive ourselves on promptness and our client satisfaction." "Then why did it take so long, Mr. Miltch?" "Call me Leo, ma'am." "We've just had many people inquire about our services," I lied, trying to ease the tension. "So that might have been part of the delay, but I promise you we value all of our present and future clients' time." She glowered. "Mr. Miltch, I don't have time for your bullshit. From the looks and smell of you, you probably spent the entire morning in a bar. Now if you want to sell me something, let's get a move on. And take off your shoes. I don't need you tracking any filth inside." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, slipping off my shoes as she walked in. The house was dark inside, with wood panels used for walls, the type that went out of date a decade before I was born. The sound of small paws dashed towards me. A small Pomeranian barked incessantly. So far, I was 2 for 2. "Missy, get in here and stop your barking!" Gladys shrieked through the house. The dog turned and trotted to a room. I walked behind it. I saw Gladys sitting in a small den area. She watched impatiently as I entered. I looked around for a seat, but she and her dog had claimed the dark-colored couch. "All right, where would you like for me to set up my stuff?" She pointed to a dirty recliner sitting in the corner. "You can take a seat over there." I sighed at the sight of the filthy green recliner. When I settled in the seat, I realized how uncomfortable it felt. Probably the worst chair I've ever had to sit in. Gladys stared at me and motioned her hands, wanting me to hurry. I unlatched the briefcase. I pulled the knives out first. These knives are our best sellers right now. They're American-made, giving jobs to lots of hard-working folks. They can—
I'm not interested in your dumb knives, Mr. Miltch, Gladys interrupted. I want vengeance.
I closed my eyes, not surprised. Of course you do, ma'am.
I sense judgment from you, Mr. Miltch. It's pretty rich, too. You are the one that's going door to door offering revenge for people.
I mean no offense, but what could a woman your age possibly want retribution for?
Do you know what happens when you get old?
I stared blankly. I knew she meant for the question to be rhetorical. I watched Gladys on the couch, gently rubbing on her dog Missy. I felt her anger from across the room. A bitter feeling clung to the air as I sat silently.
They toss you away, Mr. Miltch. You are worthless to society. Adults treat you like a burden. And teenagers? They are the worst. They taunt and laugh. Somewhere after 65, it just goes to hell. The world views you as powerless.
And what does that have to do with ending someone's life? I asked.
I want to show them I am not powerless, even if the only people that ever know that are the two of us.
I gazed into my briefcase. The black box lied there, as my hands faintly trembled. I opened it, placing the book and dagger on the armrest. I retrieved the paperwork and walked over to Gladys. Fill these out for me. I'm going to step outside. I walked into the yard and took a long drink. I felt the need to numb myself as I called the boss. He would be happy. It would be another big sale, and I'm sure Lou would be furious. The only thing I felt was dread, though. The failure I damned another person, even if they were as mean as Gladys Hien. I fumbled between my phone and lighter as the phone rang. "Hello?" my boss answered. I sold her. It didn't take much, boss.
That's why I sent you, killer. He laughed. Now, once you seal the deal, call me back. I have something important that I need to talk to you about.
Sure, I replied glumly. I placed the flask to my lips, feeling defeated again. I didn't even try to talk Gladys out of the deal. I knew it wouldn't have worked even if I had tried. The only thing left to do was to wait for her to finish the paperwork.
All right, well, just reach out when you finish and we can go over some business.
The phone clicked. I smoked my cigarette and listened to the boys play in the street. It was hard to understand. I tried to wrap my head around it, but I couldn't. The idea of wanting to take someone's life to feel powerful again was dark, even for me. I took the last drag and tossed the cigarette aside, heading back into the house. The dog barked when the front door opened. When I entered the room, Gladys passed the paperwork to me. They were all in order. I motioned for her to step over as I reached for the dagger. I laid my hand out. "Give me the palm of your hand," I said as I grasped the knife. It must have been the whiskey as my hand shook when cutting into her hand. My lines were not as straight as usual, and Gladys whined with anger as I dug the blade into her skin.
Is this your first time?
Gladys growled. I shook my head. You make 63, actually.
You think you would be better at it by now?
I held onto her hand as it dripped blood, placing the dagger back on the armrest, and retrieved the book. I turned through the pages, stopping briefly at the last one. 63 people I had condemned. I placed her hand onto the paper, watching as it soaked onto the thick page. Now say the name of the person you want revenge on, I muttered. She looked at me with anger in her eyes.
Clint Berenger.
The bloody palm finished the crimson seal. I released her hand and wiped the blade down before I placed it and the book back into the black box. I packed up everything quickly. I did not want to spend another moment inside her house. This woman was something else. It was a darkness I had never encountered in my time as a traveling salesman. She sickened me. Gladys headed back to the couch, but before she could sit, a scream came from outside. She immediately walked down the hallway and through her front door. The dog ran too and barked wildly. I fetched my things and followed her. When I stepped onto the porch, I could see Gladys watching something in the street. "Someone please help me!" a voice screamed. Her dog barked and growled madly at the picket fence. But when I looked past it, I saw James knelt down on the ground. It was over the body of a sandy, blonde-haired boy. My stomach churned when I realized that was the name Gladys had spoke. I turned to her, whose eyes remained locked to the sight. I searched her face, hoping to see humanity, but I didn't find it. I saw no regret. It had a smile across it, one that stretched from ear to ear. The bitter old woman was satisfied with what she had done today. She cackled. "All right, Missy, let's go back inside." Gladys turned around. I heard her footsteps and the door close behind me. James cried over his dead friend, a young boy whose life had been thrown away, and it was because of an angry old woman who wanted to feel powerful. I retrieved my flask from my pocket and tried to take a drink when I realized it was empty. I had to leave this house. I quickly shuffled to my car. My hands shook when I placed them on the steering wheel. I had witnessed something evil today, and from a little old lady. I drove off as fast as I legally could. I had to get away from her. The bottle of whiskey sat in the brown bag, and I removed it. I took a long sip from the bottle itself and pulled out my phone. I remembered the boss wanted to speak to me about some business. It made me paranoid. Strange thoughts went through my head. The idea that he knew I had been sharing my stories of what I'd been doing for a living. But he could become more suspicious if I didn't call him. I picked up my phone and took a deep breath, calling him as I began to smoke a cigarette. "How's my killer?" his voice asked. I'm doing fine. I closed the deal with Gladys Hean." "Ha ha, I knew that you could. That's why I sent you," he replied. "What did you want to talk to me about, boss?" I asked, as my mind raced to try to process the possibility of what he might have known. "How does senior sales associate sound to you?" "It sounds like a nice promotion, boss," I replied. "Good. I'm going to send you on a job, and after that, we can talk about your promotion." "What's the job?" "I need you to collect on a very late payment." My heart sank. My stomach turned. The only thing I hated more than sealing a deal was being the one to collect. It was never a pleasant thing to experience, but I felt like I couldn't say no. He might sense something was up if I did. "All right, boss. Send me the address." Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's me, the Right Hand of Doom, and I just want to thank you very much for watching this video. And I do ask that you like, favorite, share, and subscribe. Comment down below whether you like this story if you want to see more. And I also want to remind you that Laughably Dapper Entertainment is out and available on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and soon our YouTube channel. We have the first 2 episodes up on YouTube, but you can catch up to episode 4 on the subsequent channels. And of course, be sure to share those with everyone else too. And be sure to like and favorite. You can also support us on Patreon. I have my own Patreon page, as you might know, but we also have one for Laughably Dapper. It goes a long way and every little bit helps. Alright ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much again for your time, and again I do hope to bring you more of Mr. Miltch's fascinating story. I hope to see you in the next episode. Until then, sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.